Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 9. Today, I'm going to give you a brief overview for Unit 3, which is our final unit of the class. And then I'll just talk briefly also about innovation and intellectual property. So in terms of our final overview, in this last unit, you're going to be covering innovation and intellectual property, business and marketing, and putting together a capstone project. You also will have your final projects, which are kind of equivalent to the final exam. Please note that this is on Friday, April 9th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. So the real goal of this final unit is to kind of put it all together. You spent the first 2 units learning in depth about hardware and software, troubleshooting, figuring out technologies, and hopefully starting to think about how you might want to use some of these technologies for your own purposes. In this unit, you're going to take all the things that you've learned and try to apply the technologies into an innovative solution for a problem that you see in occupational therapy or occupational science. A few notes about the final unit. For these last 3 classes, you'll have assignments to turn in each week at the start of each class instead of quizzes. So these assignments should help you to make progress towards the final project. There will be some time, both asynchronous and synchronous, for you to be working on your final project, but please note that the assignments could take some additional time, especially if you decide to work on a prototype. For the final project, you can work individually or you can form teams of up to 3 people. If you're on a team, you need to perform each of the weekly assignments on your own, but your final project grade will be shared, and that will make more sense in a second. Finally, your weekly assignments, whatever you write for those, don't lock you into the final project ideas. So for instance, if this week you write about an innovation that you have, but then in our synchronous class, people discuss and you decide you want to team up with someone else and work on their project, that's totally fine. The assignments are more for you to get a feel for how to do each of these pieces on your own. And if you're working on a team, then you would take after you turn in the assignment, then you can compare documents and see what you like about each other's and merge them. So in terms of what the assignments are, this week your assignment will be to submit an innovation statement, and we have a template on this in Blackboard that will be a description of the work, a description of the novel features of the work that you're trying to propose, and how it's different from the state of the art in OSOT. So this is kind of the heart or essence of innovation. It should be less than 1,000 words, and it's just a Word document. This week, you can also start working on a prototype if you'd like to build one. For week 10, your assignment will be to submit a business plan, and it will include a needs assessment, plan for moving forward, budget rationale, and timeline. And this is something that obviously the lecture for week 10 will cover. For week 11, we'll go over presentation and kind of like business pitches, and we'll have you submit a presentation or pitch slide deck, as well as hopefully you'll be working on finalizing the prototype. And then finally, for the final project presentations, you will do a live presentation of your work, which will use the pitch deck. And the pitch deck obviously should incorporate elements of your business plan and innovation. And then you'll also submit a prototype, and that prototype could be a full sketch and design description that we'll talk about, or an actual prototype. Okay, so for the final project presentations, it should utilize components from the class assignments, and it will ultimately consist again of a short oral project pitch with the slide deck that you'll be making for one of your assignments. It should also include a submitted prototype. So this is a full sketch or plan of what will be made and how, and if possible, some component of an actual prototype, whether or not it works, since as you've seen in our class so far, things don't always go quite how you would like them to. As a side note, this would position all of you to submit an application for the Moshe Yeti Award. Those applications are due Monday, April 12th, so after the class finishes. If you should decide to, that said, there is no pressure to submit for it, but we have tried to make this class and these last few assignments kind of in line with what you would need if you wanted to submit an application so that you don't have to redo the wheel. In terms of the rubric, it actually is also very similar to the Moshe Yeti Award rubric. The main difference is we added that you need to utilize technology that we've discussed in weeks 1 through 8. There will be 9 items that will score your final project pitch and prototype design on. Each one is worth 5 points for 45 points in total for your grade. And they are as follows. So the project should address an important problem or opportunity relevant to OT or OS. It should address a significant clinical or educational need. It should be innovative, and that's where we're going to make sure that in the innovation, it utilizes some aspect of technology that we've talked about, whether it's software, hardware, 3D printing, etc. The project should be evidence-based, and the science supporting the project should be compelling. That just means there should be some background for why you're doing it. You should be able to back up that this project will be helpful for people. The project is useful and has the potential to advance quality of OT service delivery. The presentation was prepared and delivered professionally and compellingly. The business plan is well developed, clearly articulated, and reasonable. Samples of work or prototypes demonstrate a plan for future development. And again, these samples should have something to do with the technologies that we've worked on in this class. And finally, presenter provides clear and insightful responses to questions. So Dr. Lane and I will be providing the final grade scoring and feedback. We will make these rubrics available to you afterwards. However, we also are going to have each of you fill out these forms for each other, so you get in the practice of evaluating each other's projects. Your evaluations of one another will not be for a grade, but it will be to provide feedback for one another. And I think it's always a good learning experience when you're trying to evaluate a different person's work. Please note that the feedback should be constructive, and if it's going to be critical feedback, then we ask that it's actionable. So not just, I didn't like this or I didn't like that, but something like this project could be improved by adding this or changing this, etc. And that's just a good rule of thumb for critical feedback in general. The prototype, like we said, should be a full plan of what will be done and how. Ideally, you would have tried to make at least some part of it. It doesn't have to work, although bonus points if it does. The business plan should also include what types of expertise you would need to create the full prototype. So hopefully we've also taught you about that in this class. And the pitches, if you're on a team, the pitch time should be shared across all members equally so that each person has a chance to talk. The total time we'll have to figure out once we know the number of presenters and teams, but it'll be somewhere between 8 and 15 minutes per pitch. Okay, so we can talk about all of that in class. We'll have some time for questions and answers. But now I'm going to give you just a brief lecture now. So this week, we are going to talk about innovation and intellectual property. I will do a brief overview of some of my experiences to just kind of make it feel a little bit more real, I guess. We have an amazing guest lecture by Donaldson Santos, who's the Associate Director for Licensing at Stevens Center for Innovation. This is pre-recorded and it's a separate YouTube video. And then we will come back to this video and we will go through a hands-on lab/year assignment for the week, which is walking through a kind of modified version of an invention disclosure. So I'm just going to briefly show you what it is. I think it's pretty self-explanatory, and then you'll have a little bit of time to do it on your own. For the synchronous class, we are going to be discussing final project ideas. So what you submit is essentially what you can talk about in class. You'll have time for Q&A about any aspect that I've talked about here, and then we'll have time to work on building out the ideas a little bit more. If people want to start chatting in smaller groups and form teams, that's also fine. And Dr. Lane and I will be around to provide feedback and answer any questions. Okay, so for this week, our goals are that you would understand what constitutes an innovation. You'll be able to describe the invention disclosure process here at USC, and then you could practice creating and describing your own innovation and especially the novel features of the innovation. So briefly in a nutshell, because I think especially for OTs, it's not so common. I think in the School of Engineering, for instance, everybody has some sort of innovation or IP disclosure. But in OT, it's a little bit less common, but part of the goal of our class is to make it more common. So by teaching you about the process and what happens in it, hopefully it becomes more ingrained in our culture. So I actually started my faculty position here at USC in January of 2015. I went to a conference with a friend and it was about virtual reality. And I thought to myself, we could use virtual reality with some of our brain-computer interface work that we already have, and it could be really useful. And it's something that isn't being done yet. So with a few colleagues, I developed the concept and ideas behind reInvent, which is our brain-computer interface with VR, which you've probably at this point heard quite a bit about from Coralie and Octavio and also Chris. And so I actually submitted that as a invention disclosure to USC. We also submitted it as a grant for the American Heart Association so that we would have funding so that we could actually build what we were proposing to build. And to note, especially if you listen to Donaldson's lecture, submitting a grant is not a public disclosure because it's just to a small confidential body of reviewers. In September, I submitted an invention disclosure to USC through Sophia, which he mentions in his video, and which you'll be kind of filling out a form to get an idea of what an invention disclosure consists of. At that point, a licensing associate from Stevens came and talked to me about the concept. And in the end, the licensing associate made the decision to license the software, but not patent the system or anything. And a part of that was because we were using products that were off the shelf. So we weren't actually building anything ourselves. We just used things that were commercially available and we're just like sticking them together. And we made the software to make them work together. At that point, for the next few years, we continued to have discussions with different companies who were potentially interested in licensing our software or even the concept. But the problem is that the field was really young and new. The Oculus Rift had just come out in 2015. So VR was kind of all the rage, but it was mostly startup companies and they don't have a lot of money to license expensive software. In the meanwhile, we did get the grant from the American Heart Association, so we started to build the system. As we updated it, we continued to provide new invention disclosures to Stevens every time there was like a major shift in what we were doing or how we were doing it. And then most recently, we created that telerehab at-home platform that I told you about. And because for that one, we actually started to fabricate our own hardware in addition to software that created an entire system. We disclosed it to Stevens and then they decided to file a provisional patent, which you'll also learn about. So what that means for us is we now have 1 year to potentially find an industry partner who's interested in licensing this whole concept and pursuing a full patent to build out the system. So that's where we are. It's been pretty interesting, I think, learning about what innovation is and isn't. A lot of times innovation can, like you'll learn in the video, it can be ideas. It can be like lifestyle redesign, for instance. It can take on all different types of forms. And I think in OT, we have a lot of opportunity to innovate and create new things that could be really valuable. So the bottom line from my experiences is to talk to a licensing associate if you have any questions. Donaldson puts his contact information for his office on his slides as well. But it's a really kind of fun and interesting process to learn about what happens once you have an idea and where does it go from there and what are the different options and pathways that it can take. So hopefully that was interesting for you. This next part is you're gonna watch the video from USC Stevens, and then we'll come back and do a short worksheet about the licensing disclosure or the invention disclosure process. Okay, thanks a lot.